century before Christ, the generation, say, before Jesus, Israel was swept into the maelstrom of the Roman Civil War. Not just the Roman Empire, but Roman Empire at war with itself. The Civil War that went on for almost 20 years of savage fighting. Legions against legions on both sides. Julius Caesar had gone west, of course, and Pompey had gone east, and it was Pompey who brought the Roman Empire really to Israel. At that time, say in the 60s BCE, in the 60s when Pompey arrived and desecrated the temple, by the way, by his presence, there was a native Jewish dynasty called the Hasmoneans, or the Maccabees, ruling there for almost 100 years, from roughly 160 BCE to 60 in round numbers. What the Romans did was eliminate the Hasmonean dynasty and put in a new one they were more secure with, one they felt was more stable, the Herodian dynasty. So as soon as we think of Herod the Great, the first of the Herodians, you're talking about Rome's appointed King of the Jews. Always hear that title as a Roman title. Only Rome could declare King of the Jews. So for example, when the Magi arrive to Herod, asking, where is the newborn King of the Jews? Herod immediately, as you know from Matthew 1 and 2, recognizes that this is treason. And the next time you'll see King of the Jews in Matthew's Gospel will be on a Roman cross. So, King of the Jews. Actually, Herod had been appointed King of the Jews before actually the fight between Octavian and Antony, the last round of the Roman civil wars. Together, according to Josephus, they had walked out of the Senate chamber in Rome, he says, arm in arm with Herod in the middle, and they'd gone up to sacrifice to Jupiter Capitolinus. So Rome appointed King of the Jews also meant you were under the Roman theological umbrella, of course. So think about Herod the Great. Think always that he has replaced the Hasmoneans. So there's a certain suspicious about him. You know, when you think of him, at least when I think of him, and I compare him with Henry VIII, he makes Henry VIII seem monogamous and magnanimous. He almost makes Henry VIII look like a nice guy. He's almost paranoid. And I mean, that might be unfair because he might just be realistic. Remember, Rome has appointed him instead of the native dynasty of the Hasmoneans. He's an Idumean. He's only been Jewish from a couple of generations. So always allow a huge amount of suspicion from his own people. So maybe he wasn't paranoid. Maybe he was just being accurate. But he's the Rome-appointed King of the Jews. And in the Civil War, he was actually on the wrong side. When Octavian and Antony finally broke and went to war, he was right next door to Cleopatra's Egypt, so of course he was on the wrong side with Antony. But he was smart enough to present himself after Octavian, Augustus won, and said, I was simply on the side of Rome. I thought Antony was Rome. I now know that you are Rome. And Augustus gave him back his title, King of the Jews, and he went home. So, Herod the Great, the generation before Jesus, he dominates that generation. And he is the Rome-appointed King of the Jews. He represents Romanization. You could say with Herod the Great, King of the Jews, friend of the Romans, the Roman program, Romanization, finally hits the Jewish homeland. In the generation before Jesus, Romanization hits the Jewish homeland. Now, if you look at his building activity, the first thing that strikes you is he's building magnificent fortress palaces. Palace fortresses. The both are there. You can sense in his earliest buildings, he likes luxury, but he also likes security. His ideal thing is a fortress palace. Think, for example, two of them are still visible today. First of all, the Herodium, near Bethlehem. Imagine in a natural hill, then imagine you cut off the top of the hill and built sort of inside the concave of the top of the hill. So you're not just on top of a hill, you're on top of a hill inside a hill. It's almost impossible to imagine it. But what strikes you is luxury and safety. It's a fortress and it's a palace. So when you look at his earliest building activity, what strikes you again is he's not very secure. He's Rome appointed king of the Jews, but as it were, you know, good luck on that one, if you can imagine Rome saying, you're king of the Jews and have a nice day, as it were. So think of a second one, Masada. The Herodium, Masada. I mean, it still is an awesome site today. It's right on top of a butte. It's on top of a rock that comes right up from the desert, magnificent view in all directions of the desert and towards the Dead Sea. It's magnificent, even in ruins today, but it's right up on top. You cannot imagine. It makes the Herodium actually look like a minor thing. On top of Masada, he built a palace, as luxurious as you can imagine, in the most defensible place you could imagine, right up on top of it. And his view, if you imagine him in his palatial dining room, out all over the desert in all directions and over the Dead Sea. But again, you're back, fortress, palace, palace, fortress. But he does other things as well. Under Herod the Great, two of the greatest building projects in the ancient world, bar none, were going on at the same time. In Little Israel, world class by any norms. I suppose if you thought of Rome itself, the city I mean, as a giant construction site, you could say there was something bigger going on there. But the building of the what would you call it? The port city of Caesarea Maritima, we call it, Caesarea on the coast. So he's building a new city. There has been no real city there before, a whole new city from scratch, and he's building a state-of-the-art, all-weather port. This is Romanization, because Romanization worked by all-weather ports, all-weather roads, all-weather bridges. He calls the city Caesarea. You say, okay, we get it, Caesarea. But even the port is called Sebastos, which is the Greek word for Augustus. It's a huge port, great moles going out into the Mediterranean, protecting shipping. They could come in there. Probably wouldn't rival Alexandria, but it's coming close. So that's one thing he builds. That's for his Roman masters. We're getting with your system. What about his own subjects, his own people? For them, he rebuilds the temple in Jerusalem. He builds a plaza, a new plaza around the temple. It's 15 football fields, 5 north-south, 3 east-west, 15 football fields big. And that would be impressive, of course, by itself, if it were on flat terrain. But it's on the brow of a hill. So in the northeast, to dig in to get the stone, and then build up on the south. Huge retaining walls. Even today, when you see them, they're awesome. When the Romans had to destroy the temple in 70 CE, the most you could do is push some of this stuff off the top. They almost gave up. So for his Roman masters, Caesarea, the port, the great port city on the coast. For his Jewish subjects, a refurbished, rebuilt temple. And notice what that huge plaza is called, the Court of the Gentiles. It's ironic to think of Herod the Great as the first apostle of the Gentiles, as it were. But his idea is that into his great port at Caesarea will come business, of course. That's taken for granted in commerce. But also pious pilgrims, pagan pilgrims, who will come into his port, come up to his great temple at Jerusalem to visit what is now the greatest temple in the Eastern Mediterranean. Probably more impressive even than Diana's great temple at Ephesus. So the whole Romanization program is being conducted by Herod the Great. In that city, for example, Sebastos, Caesarea, he builds a temple to Roma and Augustus, the divine couple at the heart of the New World Order, Roma and Augustus. And it's lined up off the grid of the city, so it points towards the port. So that the ships coming in are sailing, as it were, right through the aperture, straight towards the temple of Rome and Augustus. This is the New World Order. And he also built temples elsewhere. But to Roman Augustus, he built one in the north, he built one in Samaria. So this is Romanization. And our point is that Romanization, in all its implications, hits Israel in the 1st century, in the generation before Jesus. The generation before Jesus. In our somewhat quaint way of telling time, it would be from 30 BCE to 0, as it were. Another thing about Herod the Great. When he died, 4 BCE, when he died in 4 BCE and was buried, by the way, at the Herodium, revolts broke out all over the Jewish homeland. Not one coordinated, central, organized revolt, but revolts everywhere. So obviously the Romanization process he had been conducting was like, again, a pressure cooker, and as soon as he died, it sort of exploded. All over the country, revolts. The one we're primarily interested in is at Sepphoris. Sepphoris was the capital of Galilee in the north. Sepphoris, capital of Galilee in the north. And it's about 4 to 5 miles northwest of a tiny little hamlet called Nazareth. Over the Nazareth Ridge, down across the plain, they're swampy, probably you have to go around the swamps and get to Sepphoris, so it might take you longer than as the crow flies because you're not a crow. So 4 to 5 miles. Sepphoris revolted. Now this is very important because it means 4 BCE, right about the time Jesus was born, Herod died, and there was revolts all over the Jewish homeland, one of them at Sepphoris. What did the Romans do? What they always did in revolts. The Syrian legions, there was no legions in the Jewish homeland at the time. The legions are in Syria to protect the Euphrates frontier against the Parthians. The legions come south. Eventually 3 of them had to come. That means serious. Now when the Roman legions marched, they were obviously denuding their Euphrates frontier, so they came punitively. They came to teach you a lesson. We will put down your revolt and we will teach you a lesson, and we won't have to come back for 2 generations. Look at the dates. They came in 4 BCE, they came in 66, they came in 132. When they came with fire and sword, not just to put down a revolt, but to teach you a lesson. So try and imagine when a legion came east from Ptolemais on the coast against Sepphoris in 4 BCE, about the time Jesus was born. And they burned it to the ground and they enslaved this population, which means the men were killed, the women were raped, and the children were enslaved. Try and imagine what would have happened to a tiny adjacent village like Nazareth. Not that it had anything particularly worthwhile to rob, but they're going to just go right across this village, and if the men do not escape, they will be killed, and if the women do not escape, they will be raped, and if the children don't escape, they will be enslaved. So Jesus grew up right after the village, had been part of the legionary attack. Now I cannot imagine, I really cannot imagine that the main topic of conversation as Jesus was growing up in Nazareth was not about the day the Romans came. It must have been the major subject. I'm presuming that the villagers of Nazareth were able to flee and hide because they had done this so often. I'm presuming that most of the people escaped the Roman wrath. But the subject must have been the Roman Empire. So don't think about Jesus not knowing about the Roman Empire, that there's some kind of mythical beast way over there at the other end of the Mediterranean. They're the people that were in the backyard of his tiny native village just about the time he was born. And it must, I'm saying must, I cannot prove this, it must have been the major topic of conversation. So Jesus, growing up, must have had to ponder, where was God on the day the Romans came? We were fighting for God. Why did the Romans win? What does this tell me about God? What does this tell me about empire? What does this tell me about violence?